All right, we are going to go ahead and get started, guys. Thank you for joining us today. I am Anna Roberts, the Director of Government Relations for the Basic Education Coalition.
And I'm Brian Callahan, the Policy and Advocacy Director for the Global Campaign for Education-US.
And we are excited that everyone could join us today for the second part of our Advocacy 101 series. So thank you, guys. So today we're going to focus on how to hold successful meetings with a member of Congress. This is going to be especially helpful for those of you who are joining us on June 24th for our Advocacy Day, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But before we get started today, we want to flag a few tools in the webinar to help things run smoothly. So in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you have a toolbar. If you want to collapse the toolbar so that you can see things easier, just click on the orange box in the top left corner. We're going to be stopping also to take questions, but please feel free to type any questions that you might have in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. And in addition, this webinar is being recorded, so after we're done, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording and also a toolkit with additional information for you guys to review. So let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, today we're going to focus on what you can expect from a meeting with a member of Congress, plus a few tips and tricks to help you out. To begin, Brian is going to walk us through how a congressional office is set up, who makes the decisions, and who you might be meeting with.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. So in front of you should be a chart. This is a structure of a typical representative's office. A senator's office is going to look pretty similar to this, although they generally have many more staff members. Just as an example, a House of Representatives office is generally going to have about 15 to 18 people total, split between one DC office and one or sometimes two district offices in the district. Senate offices are much larger than this, and senators usually have more offices in their state to cover the whole state. Just as an example, Senator Bill Nelson, who's from Florida, has 8 regional offices in Florida. So because the decisions of how to structure the office are ultimately pretty much completely up to the member of Congress, the structure can vary somewhat, but this is a pretty typical look at how an office is structured. So at the top, you have the member of Congress, obviously. Directly below them is the chief of staff. Generally, this is the person who manages all of the staff in both the DC and the district offices. Below the chief of staff is what's called senior staff. So that includes the communications director, which is a pretty self-explanatory position, handling all the communications and press for the member of Congress. The district director, who manages all of the in-district staff, and we'll go into that in a minute. And the legislative director. The legislative director, which is sometimes called the LD, is basically responsible for all of the legislative actions, votes, etc. that a member of Congress takes. So below the legislative director, and again, I know we're going a little fast, but feel free to write in your questions if any of this is unclear and we'll answer it. So below the legislative director is the legislative assistant, and there are usually 2 to 4 legislative assistants in an office, and they handle multiple legislative issues. And if you're scheduling a meeting, especially a meeting in the DC office with a member of Congress or a senator, usually the legislative assistant is who you'll be meeting with. Even if you're meeting with the member of Congress, they'll bring into the meeting the legislative assistant who's covering the issue that you're talking about.
So, for example, I was a senior LA in a member of Congress's office who was on the Foreign Affairs Committee. But as Brian mentioned, you handle multiple issues as a legislative assistant. So I helped with the Foreign Affairs Committee work, but I also worked on education, appropriations, health policy, all the way down to postal services. So I definitely had a full plate. And since legislative assistants handle multiple issues, they might not know all of the details of what you are coming in to talk about, but that's another reason that these meetings are so great, that they can really look to you as the technical experts to help understand some of the finer nuances of an issue, especially since the legislative assistants are the ones who are putting together issue briefs for the member of Congress, and they're making recommendations. It's really helpful to have these kind of in-depth policy discussions. And then what they do is they take the information from those meetings and they'll write a memo that then goes up the chain to the legislative director, to the chief of staff. So everyone sees what happens in the meetings, even if you're meeting with a legislative assistant.
Yes, exactly. Thanks, Anna. Some other roles, just so you know about them in an office. The legislative correspondent is sometimes called the LC, catalogs all of the mail, the phone calls, the letters that constituents send to the office, and then prepares responses from the member of Congress. So anytime you make a phone call to your member of Congress's office and express your opinion on an issue, that will get entered into a system probably by the interns, but that is managed by the legislative correspondent who kind of provides a tally to the member of Congress and the other staffers about what constituents are calling in or writing in about. A couple other people that are important for advocacy and for setting up meetings are the schedulers. There are two, usually in an office, a district scheduler who handles all of the member of Congress's time when they're in the district, and one in the DC office that handles all of their time while they're in DC. It's worth noting that most members of Congress spend basically every weekend in their districts, that they fly back and forth between Washington and their districts. And so we'll talk next week about some of the ways that you can engage them when they're in the district. So yes, schedule is very important. If you are submitting a meeting request to the member of Congress through an online form, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, generally that meeting request is going to go to the scheduler. So they are very important in controlling all of the member of Congress's time. In the district office, you usually have caseworkers, as I mentioned, a scheduler for their time in the district, someone who handles communications and outreach, and a staff assistant. And you also have at least one staff assistant in the DC office. These are usually pretty administrative level positions. But if there's an especially busy day, if you have a meeting scheduled with an office or you have a meeting scheduled with a legislative assistant, it's possible that something will come up that will require them to not be able to attend your meeting. And so sometimes the staff assistant or the legislative correspondent will take that meeting, and then they will write a memo about the meeting that they had with you that goes to the legislative assistant. Below the staff assistant are the interns. Usually if you are walking into the office or you're calling an office, this is the person you'll be interacting with, so be nice to them. Also because they are generally very hard, they're very overworked and underpaid because they're not paid at all, so be nice to the interns.
Not that you wouldn't, originally. So we just had a question about, how much time the members of Congress spend in their district versus DC. So the way that a legislative work week happens is usually votes start on Monday night. So a lot of times the member of Congress will be in their district for part of Monday morning, fly into DC to make sure that they're back for votes on Monday night. So they're in DC Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and for part of Friday when they fly back. And that's kind of a typical work week. But then you also have kind of chunks of time which they call district work periods, where they're back in their district for a full week. And those are usually around holidays. So 4th of July recess, Memorial Day recess. It ends up being probably almost once a month. And then there's also a large chunk of time in August, the August recess, where they'll be in their districts exclusively. So when you look at it, it's probably at least a good 50-50 split when you take into account the work period, the district work periods.
And that process is generally decided, especially in the House, by the leadership. So the majority party, in this case the Republicans, decide at the beginning of the legislative session how much time the Congress is going to spend in Washington and when are the district work periods, and then they publish that information so the Congress people know generally when they're going to be coming to DC and when they're going to be in their districts.
And that's actually public knowledge, or it's publicly posted. If you go to house.gov or senate.gov, you can look on the majority websites. There's a link on the front page when you get there that'll have a link to the congressional calendar so you can see.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. It is helpful if you're planning to invite a member of Congress or you want them to come speak at something to consult that information when you're planning, because you will know generally if they're going to be in their district, and you can sort of plan your event around the time when they're going to be in the district.
And one last question. Somebody asked for a little bit of an explanation on what a caseworker is, since we skimmed over that one a little bit. A caseworker is someone who works as a liaison between constituents and federal agencies. So if you live in a district and you're having problems with, say, your Social Security or your disability benefits, you can actually contact your member of Congress, and they will contact that federal agency for you and flag whatever issue that you're having, which can be a great way to kind of get attention to the issue that you are having. But that's their sole job, is to work as a liaison between constituents and federal agencies. So we'll go ahead and move to, now that we understand how a congressional office is set up, how you would go about requesting a meeting. And Brian touched on this a little bit. If you want to meet with a member of Congress, you'll need to reach out to their scheduler, either in the district or in the DC office. You can call the office and ask for the scheduler's name and send them an email, but often what you'll need to do is submit a written request through their official website, and you can find that either at house.gov or senate.gov. There will be a link to each individual member's official website, and usually a link on there on how to request a meeting with the member of Congress. One thing to keep in mind is that members of Congress usually only meet with their constituents just because of how much they have going on, or if you have a business in their district, they're more likely to meet with you as well. If you are unable to meet with a member of Congress, for some reason, if their schedule is incredibly full or they're not in the district or in the DC office that week, you'll meet with a legislative assistant. And again, to do this, you just call the office and ask for the staffer who handles the specific issue that you want to talk about. And the great thing about the House and Senate is all of the emails follow a standard format that we have listed here. So say I worked for the House of Representatives, my email address would be anna.roberts@mail.house.gov. Or if I was on the Senate side, say working for Senator Mikulski, I would be anna_roberts@mikulski.senate.gov. The other thing to flag there is you want to schedule your meetings at least 2 weeks in advance, just because their schedules fill up so quickly, making sure that you get on their radar.
One other thing to note, when we were talking about when they're in session and when they're not in session, we were saying that you can access that information. Generally, legislative staff are a little bit more accessible when Congress is not in session. That is, when their bosses are back in the district and doing events and handled by district staff, the legislative staff in Washington have a little bit more time to meet. So sometimes you might have a little bit more success getting a meeting, especially if it's on short notice. If it's on a Friday, say when the member of Congress has gone home, or if it's during one of those district work weeks.
So once you have a meeting scheduled, we wanted to go over a little bit about logistics of Capitol Hill, because it's a big place and it can be a little bit confusing. So you have a map here of what Capitol Hill looks like. On the top right in blue, you have the Senate offices. There are 3 main offices for the Senate side. There's Russell, Dirksen, and Hart. If you're traveling by metro, the closest station is Union Station. On the House side, which is in red on the more of the bottom side of the map, you have 3 main offices. You have Rayburn, Longworth, and Cannon. There is an additional office in Ford, but you're not often going to have meetings there. It's kind of extra space for staffers. And then the closest metro stop is going to be Capitol South. But no matter where you're Interesting. So we just learned that we have lost our volume for a few seconds there. Great. So we'll not exactly sure where we lost it. So we'll actually just quickly go back over that slide, just because we're not exactly sure where we lost it. But just quickly, the logistics for the House and Senate side. For the Senate side, the offices are in blue in the top right. The main offices are Russell, Dirksen, and Hart. And your closest metro stop is going to be the red line at Union Station. For the House side, your main office buildings are Rayburn, Longworth, and Cannon. And there is an additional office in Ford, but you don't often have meetings there. And then your closest metro stop there is the orange and blue line at Capitol South. But the other thing that we wanted to flag before we lost audio was that you want to make sure that you include at least a good 15 to 20 minutes to go through security. Each of the buildings has a security checkpoint to enter. And especially during the summer months, this is true that you want to add additional time because of school groups or tourists. You want to make sure that you aren't late for your meeting.
And 2 additional points. Some of this might seem like common sense, but you'd be surprised at how rare that is. Do not try to bring any weapons into the Capitol. The security for all of these buildings is similar to going through an airport security. You can bring water bottles and food into any of these buildings that are in blue or red. But I also wanted to mention that it's very rare that this would happen, but sometimes you might have a meeting that's actually in the U.S. Capitol building, especially if you're meeting with, say, the Speaker of the House or someone in a leadership position. You might have a meeting that's actually in the Capitol. In that case, you will need to go through the Capitol Visitor Center, which I will just try to show. I don't know if you can see our.
I think we can
draw. Anna will draw it on there. And if you have a meeting in the Capitol and you're going through the Capitol Visitor Center, that security is a little bit more strict, and you cannot bring any food or beverages in there. And because the Capitol Visitor Center is where all of the visitors get into the Capitol, the lines for security for that can also be fairly long. So if by some off chance you are meeting in the Capitol, and generally the person you're meeting with would tell you that, just make sure you leave extra time and make sure you don't bring any food or beverages in there.
So we had a question about, what are the advantages to meeting with an LA versus the member of Congress? And to be honest, they each have their benefits. Obviously it's great to have a face-to-face with a member of Congress to make sure that you're getting on their radar. But the LA is really the one that's going to be doing the majority of the work on whatever the issue is. They're the ones that are going to be doing the research. They're the ones we work to reaching out. And the member of Congress has so much on their plate. Sometimes it's actually more beneficial to start a relationship with an LA, making sure that you develop, I don't want to say a friendship, but
a working
relationship with them. It can be almost more beneficial. But as I said, members of Congress, once they champion an issue, it's great to have them on board. But sometimes it can be just as beneficial to meet with an LA because they're the ones that are going to be doing the majority of the work.
Yeah, and I would just add, if you have, I guess if you have a particularly compelling story, then I think it can be really beneficial to meet with the member of Congress. And for example, if you have someone who, you're talking about cancer funding and someone who is a cancer survivor from the district, or some, compelling story that can sort of convince the member of Congress to take up an issue, then it's very beneficial if you can get a meeting with them and sort of compel them. If they decide that they want to take up an issue, then they're going to assign that to the LAs, and the LAs are going to do it because their boss is interested. But I think everything Anna said is absolutely right. The LAs do most of the actual legwork of legislation, so they are very beneficial to meet with. We always tell people, don't be discouraged if you are meeting with an LA. That's the person that is going to be doing all of the work.
90% of the work.
Yes, 90% of the work, not all.
So once you have a meeting scheduled, what can you expect? The first thing that we flag for everyone is when you meet with a legislative assistant or sometimes even an LD, they can appear very young. Usually LAs, especially on the House side, they're probably in their mid-20s. But one thing that I'll say is they are incredibly knowledgeable and they work long hours to make sure that their boss is up to date on an issue. So they appear young, but just keep in mind they're incredibly knowledgeable. Let's see. And also keep in mind that once you meet with them, every meeting that they take, they'll be writing memos, and that will go up the chain to the legislative director, to the chief of staff, to the member of Congress. And they'll also be giving recommendations on how to proceed, so it's good to kind of be in their good graces, like I said, because they're the ones that are going to kind of champion an issue, especially if they are especially passionate about it. And I'll tell this one story that If you guys know me, I tell all the time. So when I was on the Hill, I had a legislative director who loved horses. I mean, she really, she owned a horse. She loved them. She talked about them all the time. The member of Congress could not have cared less about them. But because of her passion for horses, we were on not one, but 2 different horse slaughter bills. I bet you're thinking now, I didn't even know there was one, let alone 2, but we were on both of them. So again, having a staffer with a personal issue that they really care about and that they'll push with a member of Congress can really make or break your issue. Let's see. So the other thing that we wanted to flag is that office space on Capitol Hill is at a premium. And it's very limited. So don't be surprised if you're meeting in an unconventional space. You could be meeting in a coffee shop. You could be meeting in the hallway outside of the office. You could be meeting on the couch in the lobby. And it is not a sign of disrespect in any way. There just aren't that many places to meet. The other thing is that meetings are pretty short. They're usually anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes. Sometimes they can be even shorter if it's a especially busy day with votes and things like that. So it's another great reason to make sure that you're really prepared and that your message is clear and concise.
So now that you have sort of a sense of the process and what to expect, the most important thing that you could do in advance of the meeting to prepare is research. Some things you might want to look at are what committees the member is on. Are these committees relevant to the issue that you'll be meeting with? If you were in our last webinar, you'll hopefully remember us talking about committee of jurisdiction. So just kind of knowing what are the committees that will be working on the issues you're meeting with. But beyond that, well, also looking at have they taken positions on any similar legislation? But beyond sort of just the legislative side, it's also helpful to look at what are their personal interests. And you can find that out partly by looking at their biography, and you can find that on their website. I mean, pretty much every member of Congress is going to have a personal biography on their website. When we're thinking about people who might be supportive of educational issues, we would look at, were they a teacher at some point? A lot of members of Congress have some experience like that. Were they a Peace Corps volunteer? Did they serve in the military? Did they own a business? So these are just kind of relevant things to know before you go into the meeting. And staffers will appreciate that you did some research and know a little bit about the background of their boss, and you're sort of not just coming in completely unaware of that. It's also really important to, in advance, prepare your message and talking points, partly because of what Anna mentioned, that the meeting is going to be very short, but also because the more personal that you can make this issue, the more successful you're going to be in convincing the legislative assistant or the member of Congress to take it up. So talk about why the issue is important to you. If you have a personal story or you even have someone else's story that you can share, that's going to be much more memorable for a staffer when they leave the meeting than a bunch of statistics. Statistics are good. We use statistics a lot, but if you have only sort of one shot, you can provide the statistics in a fact sheet or in a follow-up, and when you're actually in the meeting, you can tell the more personal story. This is the thing that I think most people who have never done any advocacy before probably get the most nervous about is, what are they going to say in the meeting and are they prepared? The one thing I'll say is that if you are, especially if you're a constituent, it's okay to have this written down. It's okay to have your talking points on a piece of paper, and if that makes you a little bit less nervous in the meeting, take the piece of paper in and you can look at it to make sure that you hit all the points that you wanted to make. And just remember that the staffers are not expecting you to have all of the answers or have, everything answered in the meeting, and it's perfectly okay to say that you don't know, but you'll follow up with them.
The most important part that they want to know is that people in their district care about an issue. And the more that you can show that and make your case as to why it's important to you and why they should care about it as well.
Yes, yeah. And the final thing in preparation is just make sure that you have a clear and achievable ask of the office before the meeting. For example, co-sponsoring a bill, which we talked about in our last webinar, joining a caucus, signing a letter, etc. And make sure that it's something that Congress can actually do. I always like to tell people that Congress can't throw out your parking tickets or put a speed bump on your block. So make sure that this is something that Congress actually has control over.
Because especially if you just made a really compelling case about what an issue is, that's going to be the first thing they ask is, well, what can we do? How can we help? So making sure that you have a suggestion on how they can help.
Okay, so now that you're prepared, some tips for the actual meeting. As I said, do your background research. We just talked about that. Show up on time. This is really important. These staffers often are going to have 5 or 10 meetings a day or sometimes more, in addition to deadlines, in addition to helping advise the member on votes. So if you are not on time for your meeting, it's very possible that they would not be able to meet with you at all. And I would say ideally show up to the office between 5 and 10 minutes before your meeting starts. And you should know that sometimes even when you show up early or right on time, you may end up still having to wait for them for 10 or 15 minutes, especially if there's a vote or something happening that they need to be consulted on. And again, that's not necessarily a sign of disrespect. It's just very hard when Congress is in session for them to sort of manage all of their schedules and meetings and advising the member of Congress. Dress appropriately in business attire. The only exception I would say is that some groups will wear matching T-shirts that are specially made, that have their logo or something else like that as part of a larger lobby day effort, so that, if you have 300 people on the Hill, it can be very compelling to have all of them walking around in all these different buildings wearing the same T-shirt, and then staffers will kind of start to look at it and go, oh, I wonder what these people are here doing. But unless you are part of an organized group that has a T-shirt for you, dress in business attire. And be respectful. I think that's really important. Even if you disagree with the member of Congress's office, and even if you're going in and asking them to change a position, you're still going to be a lot more successful in convincing them of your views if you're respectful than if you're confrontational. And one tip we like to give people is to try to thank whoever you're meeting with, whether it's a member of Congress or the legislative assistant, thank them for something the office has done. So if you disagree with 90% of what this member of Congress's positions are, but you find one thing that you agree on, then thank them for that one thing that you agree on.
Because like most people, they tend to hear when they've done things that are wrong. So it's always nice to hear thanks for doing something, rather than always hearing the negative.
So some things you should not do, as I just said, you should not be late. You should not be too early. Sometimes people do this with meetings. They'll think, well, they told me not to be late, so I'm going to go to the office 40 minutes before my meeting. It's not. It's just you're going to end up sitting in the office for 45 minutes, and because the offices are so small, it might make the staff just a tiny bit uncomfortable that you have shown up 45 minutes before your meeting. So my best advice to people when they are approaching this is give yourself, like we've discussed, plenty of time to get through security, to find the right building, and to find the office. But if you find the office and you get there and it's you have 30 minutes before your meeting, don't go in the office.
There are plenty of places that you can go to. Each building, usually in the basement, there's either a cafeteria or a cafe or a coffee shop where you can sit and have a drink and figure out, exactly what you want to say. So if you find yourself in a position where you have lots of time, usually go to the basement or the first floor, and there's almost always a coffee shop or a cafeteria.
Yeah. As we've already discussed, don't be disrespectful or confrontational. This is very important. Don't give false information. If you don't know the answer to a question that a staffer asks, and this happens fairly often, it's perfectly okay to say that you don't know and that you'll follow up. And it actually provides you with a good reason to follow up with the staffer after the meeting, which we'll discuss in just 1 minute. And the final thing is don't talk about a member of Congress's campaign. It's illegal for the personal office and the committee staff, so anybody that you would be meeting with on Capitol Hill in their office, it's illegal for that person to engage in any sort of campaigning while they're in the federal building and while they're being paid by the U.S. government. The members' campaign office and staff and congressional staff are completely separate, so it's really just best to steer clear of any mention of their campaign. And here's a question maybe Anna can answer. Just an example of a bad meeting and what made it bad. That's a good one.
I have so many. There were some interesting ones. One funny one, and this actually wasn't a bad meeting, but it was just funny. I had a request from a group of nudists to come in, thinking about Brian's recommendation to dress appropriately. And everyone in the office stood around because they were waiting patiently for the group of nudists to come in. Luckily, they came in business attire and everything was okay, but it was the highlight of the week for everyone in our office to see what would happen with them. But in terms of meetings that went really badly, I had one specific meeting where the people came in and they didn't agree with my boss, which is fine, but they didn't go about, kind of telling their case. They basically came about telling us all the reasons we were wrong, and started making a number of demands. And one of the demands was that they wanted us to sign a pledge saying how we would vote if something came up before the House. And so basically the ask was for a hypothetical bill, and no member of Congress is going to make a pledge saying how they would vote for something that they haven't seen, because that's the way that bills work. There's never a bill that has just one thing in it. So it might be, to give every child a puppy, like something that's perfectly wonderful, but there's a rider that no one agrees with. So you never want to make a pledge to sign something that you haven't seen. And so when we tried to explain that to him, that yes, we supported the issue, but we weren't going to be signing a pledge for something that we haven't seen, it basically came down to them becoming more and more upset about that we would not sign this pledge, and to the point where we actually had to ask them to leave. So when we say things like be respectful, it probably sounds like common sense, but you would be amazed. People get very passionate about what they're talking about, but there's a right way and a wrong way to approach staff. And just to explain, sorry, we had another question explaining what I meant by a policy writer. So in a bill, you can have a bill that is 10 pages long, and there are just a number of policies that go into it, and sometimes people try to sneak things into bills that are not part of the original intent of the bill. For example, this happens a lot with Veterans Affairs bills, because people want to support veterans. It's a position that everybody can get behind. So you'll have a bill to help veterans, and then someone will sneak an amendment in cutting funding for another agency. And that would be an example of a policy writer where you support the overall message of the bill, but someone sneaks something in that you can't support. So in the end, you have to vote against it. And so that's another reason why you probably aren't going to sign hypothetical pledges.
Just to mention that we didn't mention the word writer, but we did just briefly discuss last week in our webinar the whole process and how this can happen during committee markups and floor votes. So if that's something that you want to know more about, we have recorded our webinar, and we will make sure you get a copy of it. We're going to send out all of the recordings of the webinars and all of the toolkits once we're wrapped up. But if you didn't catch the first one, you are on, and you're here, we have your email, so you'll be getting at least a link to the video recording of it.
So you'll have a link to the video of the first webinar as well as the toolkit that was sent around that has additional information. So to wrap up, at the end, you've had a great meeting. At the end of the meeting, you probably want to say, kind of finalize what your ask is, give a summary of everything that you talked about, especially if you've talked in detail about it. But after you leave the meeting, a few days later, you're going to want to send a thank you email. You're going to want to ask if they had any additional questions once they reviewed the information that you left with them, and then see where they are on the ask that you had. If they were going to co-sponsor a bill or sign on to a letter, ask if they've done it. Staff can be overloaded, so this is a great way to bring it back to kind of the top of the things that they have to do, and make sure that it doesn't fall through the cracks.
All right, any questions? If you have a question, please write it in now. We have a couple. The first one, going back to something we were talking about earlier, is where you can research the member of Congress's record. I know I was saying that was part of the preparation for a meeting.
Mm-hmm. So Brian said it's great to know kind of how they voted on issues, and if you happen to know what the exact bill is, the Library of Congress has a database of all of the congressional votes. So if you go to congress.gov or thomas.gov, and that information will be in the toolkit that we sent out, a link to those. But again, it's congress.gov or thomas.gov. They have links to every vote that has ever happened in the House or Senate, and you can see exactly how your member of Congress voted on a certain issue. Again, you can just do kind of your basic internet research, but their official website is also a great place to hear more, because they're going to have a legislative section on it where they can also include like press releases and kind of where their priority areas are.
Someone else asked what type of materials you might want to bring to the meeting. I think that's a really good question. Generally, having concise materials, first of all, is really important when you're going to a meeting. Having facts that the legislative assistant could use in their memo. I remember what Anna mentioned, that they're going to, after every meeting, they're going to write a fairly short memo that's going to go to the legislative director and probably to the chief of staff and the member of Congress about the meeting. So if you are trying to convince them of your position, having short but very compelling facts that you can leave on a fact sheet. In our parlance, we call this a leave behind. So this is a packet of information that that you would leave with the staffer. So fact sheets. Anything else?
The other thing is a way to contact you. If you have a business card or something along those lines, making sure that if they do have questions or comments, that there's a way that they can easily contact you for a follow-up.
I would also say, though, one to not include would be really long, complex reports. If you have, even if it's like, a 30-page report, it's very unlikely that the staffer, unless they're really interested in the issue, is going to read that. So save that for if you're having a follow-up email conversation and if they ask for something more, you can provide them with your 30 or 50 or 100-page report. But generally, if you leave that with them, that's not something that's going to get looked at.
And the other thing, too, is that we're seeing more and more in kind of our green society is that people often ask that you email any attachments rather than printing out documents. It's more things to clutter their desk, and then that way they can keep them all in one place on their computer. So don't be surprised if a staffer says, thank you for bringing this in, but could you email me all this information? That's happens sometimes.
And yeah, we do have, so both GCE-US and BEC have resources that you can use if you want to have things to go into a meeting on our websites, which are gce-us.org and basiced.org. You can find fact sheets. You can subscribe to newsletters and stay up to date on what's going on and what the advocacy opportunities are.
And if you want to subscribe to our newsletter or just get additional information, at the end we'll have, actually it's the next slide, we have our email addresses if you want additional information.
Yeah. And if this all sounds really exciting and you really want to try out your advocacy skills, we hope you will join us for our Advocacy Day, our Basic Education Advocacy Day on Wednesday, June 24th. This is really, open to anybody, even if you have no experience with this. We will provide you with all of those resources, and we will provide you with all the information that you need before you go to a meeting, and we will schedule all of the meetings. So you really just have to show up and
tell your story.
Tell your story, exactly.
And it'll be a great way, to meet with staffers and to be on the Hill. This year our ask is for members of Congress to sign onto the newly organized International Basic Education Caucus. We're really excited because at the end of the Advocacy Day, we are going to have a reception where we launch the new caucus. So everybody is welcome to join us for that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even if you can't come to the Advocacy Day, you can't come to the whole thing. If you're in DC or are going to be here on June 24th, we'd love to have you at the reception. So just send one or both of us an email and we can send you the information on that as well. And that's all for this week, unless there are any last-minute questions. Next week, we'll be looking a little bit more at what are some of the advocacy opportunities and events that you can do on a more local level to engage members of Congress and other policymakers at the more local level when they're in their districts. So that will be next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. So we hope you will join us for that. If you're on this webinar, we have your email and you'll be getting an invite to that as well. I think one more thing. Yes, GCE-US does have a youth advocacy training several times a year for 18 to 25-year-olds. So if you want to participate in that, or you know someone who wants to participate in that, the next training is at the end of the month and is full, but we'll probably do one in the fall as well. So just make sure you go to gce-us.org and sign up for our newsletter so that you can find out about that. Any other last minute things before we finish? Great.
I hope this was helpful for you guys, and we will see you next week at 2 p.m. to talk about in-district advocacy.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.